I never thought I'd speak these words out loud. After I left the agency, I swore an oath to myself. No confessions, no writing, no memories. You learn early that silence isn't just safer, it's survival. But silence doesn't erase what your eyes have already seen. It only buries it. And over the years, the weight becomes unbearable. My name is Daniel Cross. From 1989 to 2001, I worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. My official role was field analysis for a program called Survival Adaptation Research. It sounded harmless, scientific, even patriotic. We were told it involved behavioral observation, stress resistance, and remote operations under extreme conditions. That's what the paperwork said. What it didn't say was that the subjects of the study weren't always human. Back then, I believed in structure, in orders, in hierarchy, in the idea that the government's secrets existed to protect people. We operated under the illusion that our work mattered more than our doubts. I was young enough to believe that. My job was to collect data, patterns of movement, reaction times, auditory responses, and to file daily reports that would vanish into the secure servers of Langley by morning. Most of the time, I didn't even know what I was recording. We were told not to ask, only to observe. The deeper I went, the less those reports made sense, until one day they did. In the early months of 1991, a briefing order arrived marked Level 7 clearance. It bore no seal, only the project code, Echo P. That was the first time I saw the words non-human cognitive integration study. No one used the term Bigfoot, not in official briefings, not even off record. The scientists called it Specimen A9, though among the handlers there was an unspoken name. The subject. No one ever said creature. It was considered a breach of protocol to assign humanity or inhumanity to what we studied. It was simply an asset. I remember the day we arrived at the test site, deep in the northern woods of Washington state, surrounded by mist and pine, miles away from any civilian settlement. The facility was an old Cold War monitoring base, repurposed into a research installation. From the outside, it looked abandoned, its walls covered in moss, windows opaque with grime. Inside, everything was sterile, chrome panels, reinforced glass, the smell of ozone and disinfectant. They called it Camp Echo Pines, though no maps listed it. The perimeter fence crackled faintly from electric current, and the only way in or out was through a guarded checkpoint manned by men who didn't wear standard uniforms. Our briefing officer, Dr. Lang, spoke with the calm detachment of someone who had seen too much already. He explained that the objective wasn't containment, it was communication. The agency had found someone, that demonstrated advanced spatial memory, auditory mimicry, and an ability to recognize symbols. It had been retrieved a year earlier in the Mount Rainier region after what they referred to as an incident of mutual aggression. The subject was injured but stable. It had survived tranquilization that would have stopped a bear. Its height was recorded at 2.4 meters, its mass nearly 180 kilograms, and its body covered in dense dark hair that seemed to regulate temperature like adaptive camouflage. Its eyes, Lang said, were human-like but deeper. That was the moment I understood why we were really there. The Cold War had ended, but the hunger for power hadn't. The agency wanted to know if intelligence could be created or found outside of mankind. The idea of a trained non-human operative sounded absurd even to us, but absurdity had never stopped science before. Our mission was to study, observe, and shape behavior through controlled stimuli, light patterns, tones, motion commands. But under that sterile language lay a darker intent, to make the subject obey. In the early days, it barely moved. It sat in the corner of its containment cell, massive shoulders hunched, its breathing slow and steady. It refused to eat or react to anyone entering the room. Some of the team called it catatonic, others said it was waiting. It was only after the third week that we noticed subtle changes. Its head turning slightly towards certain frequencies, its eyes following the red lights on the wall. It was paying attention. Lang ordered us to continue. It learns by rhythm, he said, not by threat. Each evening we would record hours of footage, the creature's responses to sound and light, its sleeping patterns, its gaze tracking. I found myself lingering after shifts, watching the monitors even when I didn't have to. There was something disquieting about it. The intelligence wasn't animal. It wasn't reactive. It was contemplative, calculating. Sometimes when the lights dimmed, I caught it watching me through the glass. Not with hostility, but with something close to understanding, as though it recognized what I was, or perhaps what I was becoming. By the end of that first month, it responded to commands. It recognized gestures, even simple instructions transmitted through tones. The handlers celebrated quietly, calling it progress. But at night, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't following orders. It was cooperating, choosing when to comply, as if it understood more than it was supposed to. Looking back now, I know that was the beginning of everything. The line where science blurred into belief. We thought we were teaching it language, control, obedience. We never asked if it was doing the same to us. It began in the winter of 1991 when our team was reassigned to the northern edge of Washington state, near the Olympic Mountain Range, a region wrapped in endless forest where fog clung to the trees and radio signals faded into static. The facility was known to us as Camp Echo Pines, though on paper it didn't exist. It had once been a Cold War listening post designed to intercept Soviet transmissions across the Pacific, but now it served a different purpose. The concrete buildings had been refurbished with reinforced walls, mirrored observation windows, and underground power systems running off a hidden generator field. The smell of the place was unmistakable: ozone, wet pine, and old iron, like the air itself carried secrets. To anyone outside, the base was just another government testing site, officially conducting field calibration for new reconnaissance equipment. The signage even said so, faded letters warning civilians about radiation monitoring. In reality, nothing was being monitored. Something was being trained. Getting there wasn't easy. We traveled in unmarked vans from Seattle, driving through long stretches of fog-thick highway, then miles of gravel roads that disappeared into the forest. The isolation was deliberate. No nearby towns, no visitors, no prying eyes. Once you arrived at Echo Pines, you belonged to it until your clearance expired. Even mail went through screening at Langley before reaching us. We were ghosts with government badges. The camp consisted of 3 main structures: a communications building that hummed with static around the clock, a barracks wing for staff, and the research compound at the far end of the clearing, a cold, windowless block of steel and concrete that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. That was where the real work happened. Cameras lined every hallway, red security lights blinked even in daylight, and motion sensors whispered softly in the ceilings. The place felt less like a lab and more like a containment site. Our team was small, 12 people, including scientists, handlers, and operatives like me, who were assigned to maintain environmental stability inside the facility. It was a vague phrase that could mean anything from adjusting oxygen levels to cleaning blood samples off containment glass. Every action we took was recorded, logged, and timed to the second. We didn't use our real names, only code numbers. Mine was Delta 4. The first few days were uneventful, almost boring. Routine checks, temperature readings, security drills. But then, during one of the morning briefings, a black binder was placed on the table. No title, no insignia, just the word "active" stamped across the front. Inside were grainy photographs, dark shapes moving between trees, enormous footprints in wet soil, something tall crouched near a riverbank, reflecting infrared light like polished stone. The briefing officer didn't bother with preamble. He just said, "We brought one in." Silence hung in the room. Nobody spoke, but the tension was palpable. Every one of us knew what that meant. The rumors had been circulating for years, stories about a capture operation near Mount Rainier, something the agency refused to confirm or deny. Now it was clear. Echo Pines wasn't built to watch the forest. It was built because of what had been taken from it. When we were finally allowed to see the subject, it wasn't in person. They showed us footage instead, grainy, low light, black and white. A figure behind reinforced glass, massive and still, its breathing audible, even through the recording. It sat with its back to the wall, head bowed, arms folded loosely over its knees. The scale of it was disorienting. You could sense the weight, the density, even through the monitor. The commanding officer, a man named Reynolds, stood at the front of the room and said, "Specimen A9, recovered 11 months ago, estimated height 8 feet, estimated mass 400 pounds. Subject demonstrates advanced motor control and recognition of spatial patterns. Objective, behavioral conditioning." He paused before adding, "This is not a myth, gentlemen. It's government property." That was the moment we understood why we were there. This wasn't observation. It was indoctrination. The subject was to be taught recognition, obedience, reaction to light, and sound cues. We weren't scientists studying nature. We were instructors in a class no one should ever have built. And as the forest outside swallowed the last of the daylight, I couldn't shake the thought that the mountains around us weren't just empty wilderness. They were waiting. The first time they assembled us in the briefing room, the atmosphere was different, colder, heavier. The fluorescent lights buzzed above the table as the projector flickered to life. On the wall appeared a blurred black and white image, taken through an infrared lens. Even through the distortion, it was unmistakable, a towering figure standing between the trees, its outline thick, massive, and wrong in all the ways a human body shouldn't be. The technician zoomed in, and the room fell silent. It was more than 2 meters tall, at least 2.4 by the scale markers, and weighed somewhere close to 180 kilograms. The code name printed beneath the image read, "Specimen A9. No one used the word Bigfoot. Not in the reports, not in conversation, not even jokingly. That word carried too much baggage, too much ridicule. Inside the agency, everything had to sound clinical, detached, verifiable. So the official classification became Unidentified Biological Entity, North American Origin. It sounded like paperwork, something you could stamp, store, and forget. But none of us forgot the image on that screen. They told us the subject had been captured almost a year earlier near Mount Rainier. A helicopter crew on a reconnaissance flight had detected unusual thermal readings deep within a ravine. A recovery team was sent in, expecting to find a bear, maybe a poacher. What they found was something else entirely. A living being that didn't fit any known taxonomy. It was wounded, disoriented, and barely conscious. Instead of reporting it as wildlife, the unit was rerouted under a new directive from the Directorate of Special Research. The coordinates were erased from the log, and the team sworn to secrecy under threat of permanent reassignment. According to the debriefing, it took 3 tranquilizer darts and a containment rig, usually reserved for large primates, to subdue the subject. When they airlifted it out, the creature barely moved. The only sound it made was a deep, rhythmic growl that registered below the range of normal human hearing. The pilot said the vibration from that sound lingered in the fuselage for days. When they landed at Echo Pines, the subject was placed inside a sealed containment chamber, reinforced with electromagnetic locks and thick ballistic glass. From that moment, it became part of the project. Dr. Lang, who led the Behavioral Research Division, gave us the first direct description. "It's not a legend," he said calmly, hands folded behind his back. "It's a biological organism with cognitive capacity comparable to early hominids, maybe higher. You will refer to it as A9. You will not assign emotional characteristics. You will not speculate about origin or purpose. You will observe and record. That's all." But the room was already full of speculation. A few of the younger analysts whispered theories: genetic mutation, evolutionary remnant, government experiment gone wrong. The older operatives stayed quiet. They'd seen enough classified work to know that the truth rarely fit neatly into categories. What mattered wasn't what it was, but why the agency had chosen to keep it alive. The slide changed, revealing close-up photos, coarse, dark hair samples under magnification, skin tissue with an unusual density, and most disturbing of all, a detailed sketch of its eyes, large, amber, and reflective, structured more like a human's than an animal's. Lang clicked through the images methodically, each one blurring the line between science and nightmare. He finished the briefing with a phrase that still echoes in my head. A9 represents an adaptive intelligence, not learned, not inherited, evolved. Then he paused, letting the silence hang. Our job is to understand it, and if possible, replicate it. When the lights came back on, I remember staring at that last photo, the eyes magnified across the screen. They didn't look alien, they looked aware. Not the empty gaze of a captured animal, but the focused stare of something that understood captivity, something that had already started learning the people watching it. That was the moment it stopped being a project for me. It became something else, a living secret, breathing just beyond the glass, reminding me that sometimes what we keep in cages isn't what we've discovered, it's what we've disturbed. From the outside, it looked like any other behavioral lab. Sterile, structured, clinical. The observation room was separated by a pane of reinforced glass 2 inches thick, the kind used for deep containment protocols. Inside, the floor was brushed steel, faintly scuffed from earlier experiments. Every surface had a sensor, microphones in the corners, motion detectors along the ceiling, electromagnetic locks on every door. The entire space pulsed with quiet energy, the hum of hidden machinery running somewhere below the floor. It wasn't a prison, not exactly. It was a training ground. We were told to think of it as a conditioning program, though the term training slipped out more than once. Each session followed a pattern: stimulus, observation, reinforcement. Lights would flicker in rhythmic intervals, tones would play through the overhead speakers, and our team would document every shift of posture, every twitch, every flicker of awareness. It was as much about what it ignored as what it noticed. For the first month, the subject didn't move. It sat motionless in the corner of the cell, its back against the wall, face pressed between its knees. The only sign of life was the slow rise and fall of its chest. At first, we thought it was tranquilized, still recovering from the injuries sustained during capture. But blood work showed normal levels. The body temperature was slightly lower than human average, the heart rate slow but stable. It wasn't unconscious, it was waiting. When Dr. Lang ordered food to be placed inside, the handlers set down a tray of fruit, roots, and protein paste, then retreated behind the blast door. For 2 days, nothing happened. On the third, the bananas were gone. No one had seen it move. Lang's approach was methodical. "Conditioning through sound is more effective than visual stimuli," he said during the second week. "Start with subsonic frequencies. Let it feel before it hears." We adjusted the sound system to output low frequencies down to 18 hertz, a tone too deep for human ears, but strong enough to make the glass hum. The first time we tried it, the subject stirred, its head lifted slightly, nostrils flaring. A second tone, higher but still inaudible to us, made it turn its head precisely toward the source. The movement was deliberate, not reflexive. That was the first measurable response. Over the next sessions, the pattern became consistent. When the low frequencies played, it raised its head. When light flashed in synchronization, its eyes followed. Over time, it began to anticipate the signals, responding before the tone started, as if predicting it. The reaction logs filled faster than we could process them. Lang said it was learning associations, building a kind of language through vibration and rhythm. "He hears what we don't," he murmured once, standing near the glass, "and he understands what we can't." The behavior team wanted to test range recognition, so they moved to more complex patterns, alternating lights and tones, coded sequences designed to mimic command-response protocols. To our astonishment, it adapted quickly. Within a week, it was performing simple motions, standing, sitting, turning toward the source. At one point, a technician accidentally dropped a metal rod, and the sound, a sharp, high-pitched clang, made the creature flinch violently. For a second, it seemed ready to lunge, but instead it froze, staring at the fallen tool. Then, slowly, it reached out, picked it up, and placed it back on the counter through the feeding hatch. That moment silenced the entire observation room. There was no aggression, no confusion, only recognition. The action was too precise to be instinct. Lang said nothing for a while, then noted quietly into his recorder, "Motor coordination intact, object awareness advanced." By the end of the second month, the sessions shifted from observation to interaction. Lights no longer startled it. Sound cues no longer confused it. It waited for them. It was responding to us. Whether through sound, movement, or presence, it was communicating, not as a subject following orders, but as something aware of being studied. And for the first time, I felt the unsettling thought that maybe the training wasn't one-sided. Maybe it was testing us. By the end of that summer, the program had shifted from observation to command. What began as a passive study of reflexes turned into a structured language of signals, short bursts of sound, rhythmic pulses of light, and carefully timed intervals between them. We were told these combinations were meant to simplify behavioral alignment. In reality, they were orders, primitive at first: stand, sit, approach, retreat. Each command corresponded to a pattern of tones between 40 and 200 Hz, frequencies low enough to make the glass vibrate softly with every cue. The first time it responded fully, the room fell silent. The tone pulsed twice, and the subject, A9, lifted its head, turned toward the illuminated panel, and stood. The movement was fluid, deliberate, almost graceful. When the second tone followed, it sat back down. Lang nodded but didn't speak. Instead, he wrote something in his notebook and pressed the next command. The light shifted to a pale green, and A9 began walking toward it. Each step was slow but balanced, heavy enough to make the reinforced floor tremble slightly. The progression over the following weeks was unsettlingly fast. What took weeks for an animal to learn, it accomplished in days. By the fourth week, it no longer waited for cues, it anticipated them. Sometimes it moved before the lights changed, as though it knew what came next. Lang theorized it was recognizing rhythm, understanding the pattern, not just reacting to the stimuli. I wasn't sure which was worse, the idea that it had learned our signals or that it had learned us. The eyes were what none of us could get used to. They weren't wild or animal. They were focused, intelligent, searching. When it looked through the glass, it didn't look at us. It looked into us, tracing every motion, every breath, every hesitation. The technicians avoided eye contact after a while. Even behind the glass, it felt wrong, intrusive, as though the thing inside was quietly memorizing every person who entered that room. Then, one afternoon, something happened that changed the tone of the entire project. During a calibration session, a young technician named Harris fumbled a wrench while adjusting the external locks. The metal clanged loudly against the floor and rolled to the base of the glass wall. A9's head turned instantly toward the sound. The technician froze. We watched from behind the control monitors as the creature rose, crossed the containment space, and crouched beside the glass. For several seconds it simply looked at the wrench. Then, slowly, it extended one of its long hands, the fingers almost human but broader, stronger, and used two of them to pick the tool up. It examined it briefly, then reached toward the small transfer hatch built into the containment barrier. The hatch opened automatically from the outside, and with surprising gentleness, it pushed the wrench through. The entire observation team stared in silence. Harris didn't move for nearly 10 seconds. Then he reached out, took the wrench, and backed away without saying a word. A9 remained crouched there, watching him, before returning to its corner. Lang finally broke the silence. "Document that," he said. Voluntary object exchange, initiated without directive. He paused and added quietly, almost to himself, he wanted us to know he understood. After that, the dynamic inside the lab changed. The air felt heavier, quieter. No one wanted to be left alone in the observation room. The night shifts became longer, more cautious. We started rotating guards to monitor the live feed 24 hours a day, not because it was dangerous, but because it wasn't sleeping. At first, we thought it was just rest cycles different from ours, but the longer we observed, the clearer it became. A9 didn't rest. The cameras showed it standing for hours, motionless, staring into the control room through the one-way glass. It didn't blink, it didn't move. It simply watched. One night, when the lab was nearly silent, I walked past the monitoring station and glanced at the live feed. The image was dark, just a faint reflection of light across the cell. But as I turned to leave, its head moved slightly, not toward the sound, but toward me. It couldn't see me through the monitors. There was no direct camera feed in that angle. Yet somehow, it knew. From that night on, I stopped thinking of A9 as an experiment. It wasn't being conditioned, it was learning. And it had started learning about us. By October of 1992, the routine had started to break down. Too many months inside that facility had eroded discipline, and people began cutting corners. The rules were simple. No one entered the containment wing without dual authorization, and the electromagnetic field had to remain active at all times. Those safeguards were supposed to be absolute. But that night, someone ignored them. His name was Nolan. He was one of the junior operators, young, ambitious, the kind of man who thought the rules didn't apply if you were careful enough. The logs show he had finished a maintenance check on the outer locks at 2247. The cameras captured him standing near the secondary gate, swiping his keycard twice. No one knows why he decided to go inside. Maybe he wanted to see it up close. Maybe he thought he could handle it. The only thing we know for sure is that the moment he crossed the threshold, everything went wrong. The power fluctuation lasted less than 5 seconds. On the monitoring screens, the electromagnetic readings dropped to 0. The containment field shimmered once, a flicker of static, and then the video feed began to distort. At first, we thought it was interference from the power surge. The audio cut out completely, replaced by a low-frequency vibration that shook the entire control room. On the screen, we could see A9 rise from its position and turn toward Nolan. The light in the chamber began to pulse, the reflection warping the figure into silhouettes. Then, the image broke apart. For exactly 3 seconds, the screens showed nothing but noise, thick analog static crawling across every monitor. The room was silent except for the hum of the backup generators. When the picture returned, the containment chamber was empty. A9 stood motionless in the center of the frame. The door to the observation vestibule was open, and Nolan was gone. We rushed to the chamber access corridor, but by the time the locks disengaged, the entire system had rebooted itself. The field reactivated automatically, sealing the room again. Inside, nothing had changed. No struggle, no blood, not even signs of impact. The only thing left behind was his keycard, torn in half, lying in the middle of the floor just outside the glass. Lang ordered the security footage isolated and encrypted immediately. No one outside the core team was allowed to view it. Later, during the debrief, he said the system had experienced a localized electrical anomaly, a phrase that meant nothing but sounded official enough to quiet the higher-ups. But those of us who were there knew it wasn't a malfunction. The lights hadn't dimmed across the facility, only inside the containment unit. The power loss was targeted, intentional. That night, the entire facility went into lockdown. Half the staff were flown out within 24 hours. The remaining personnel, myself included, were given new clearance contracts under something called Omega Protocol. The clause was clear. Any disclosure of events, even within the agency, would result in permanent reassignment to undisclosed medical study. A polite way of saying disappearance. We all signed. No one hesitated. For weeks afterward, the air inside the lab felt wrong, heavier, electric, as if the field itself carried static even when it was active. A9 stopped responding to the usual tones and lights. It didn't move for days, didn't eat, didn't even blink. It just stood there, facing the glass, motionless. When Lang tried to resume tests, the sensors showed strange interference. Electrical patterns spiked near the glass, distorting the readings. The cameras began to glitch again, but not randomly. The distortion formed shapes, faint outlines, almost like a shadow standing where Nolan had last been seen. No one spoke of it openly, but we all felt the same thing. It wasn't that the creature had killed him. It was that he'd been taken, moved, erased, folded into something we couldn't see. Whatever the truth was, it changed the way we looked at A9 forever. It wasn't a specimen anymore. It was a system, one we no longer controlled. After that, no one went near the glass. The only ones who stayed were those willing to sign another round of paperwork, tighter contracts, deeper silence. The rest were dismissed, transferred, or quietly disappeared from the rosters. By November, half the original team was gone. Those who remained pretended not to notice how empty the corridors had become. And in that silence, A9 began to move again. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a slow purge disguised as routine bureaucracy. At first, it was just transfers. Analysts reassigned to different facilities. Security personnel rotated out for mandatory debriefings. Then came the medical leaves, the disappearances. They said people were being sent for psychological evaluation after extended exposure to classified material. It sounded clinical, harmless, even reasonable on paper. But everyone who left Echo Pines under that explanation never came back. The first to vanish was Dr. Lang. One morning his office was sealed with a strip of yellow security tape and a digital lock that hadn't been there the night before. His nameplate was removed by the afternoon. The rest of us were told he had been temporarily reassigned to Washington, D.C. But when I checked the personnel logs, his clearance ID no longer existed. His digital signature had been deleted from every system, as though he'd never been part of the project. The only trace that remained was the empty space on the lab schedule where his initials used to appear. They replaced him with a new supervisor, a man from defense with no background in biological research. His briefings were short and detached, focused more on containment than understanding. Whatever Lang had been building, whatever he had discovered, was no longer the goal. They didn't want to study A9 anymore. They wanted to erase it, along with everyone who had gotten too close. Before Lang disappeared, I had begun backing up fragments of his data onto paper, transcripts, logs, anything I could print without tripping the monitoring system. Most of it was routine, behavioral summaries, response charts, calibration notes. But one file stood out, a partial transcript from an unscheduled session. In it, Lang's voice was low, almost weary, speaking into his recorder. Subject A9 is not responding to external commands. But when I raise my voice or change emotional tone, the EEG pattern spikes. It's reacting not to order, but to intent, to emotion. It mirrors whatever it senses: fear, anger, calm. It doesn't obey us because it's conditioned. It obeys because it understands. That line still echoes in my mind. It understands. I hid that printout inside a manual binder in the comms room between two outdated signal calibration sheets. When I checked the database the next day, the file was gone. The digital directory had been purged, replaced by a blank folder labeled System Error Corrupted Archive. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a deletion. By that point, the isolation of the base had become suffocating. The outside world might as well not have existed. We weren't allowed personal calls, and outgoing transmissions were filtered through a secure relay in Langley. I began noticing men in plain clothes walking the corridors. Not scientists, not technicians. They never spoke, just observed. Every time one of them appeared near the containment wing, someone from our team would be gone by morning. Those of us who remained started to whisper. It wasn't about the creature anymore. It was about survival. We knew what happened to those who asked too many questions. The unspoken rule was simple: do your job, don't get curious, don't mention Lang's name. Still, curiosity has a way of surviving, even in fear. One night, unable to sleep, I went to the observation room and watched A9 through the glass. It stood perfectly still, facing the door, eyes dim in the low light. For a moment, I thought I saw a reflection behind it. Another figure, taller, darker, impossible to make out. Then the backup lights flickered, and it was gone. The next morning, the communications chief, the only person who might have seen the same thing on the camera feed, was flown out for medical reassessment. His workstation was wiped clean before noon. By the end of that week, our team of 12 had dwindled to 5. No official announcement, no paperwork, just missing faces at breakfast. The halls were quiet, the labs colder, the air tense with the feeling that someone was watching, not from behind the glass, but from the other side of the fence. Whatever Dr. Lang had realized, it wasn't just about A9's intelligence. It was about its connection, the way it could sense fear, tension, deceit. The agency couldn't contain that kind of awareness, so instead of controlling it, they began erasing everyone who knew it existed. That winter changed everything. The snow came early, thick and relentless, covering the forest in silence so complete it felt unnatural. The temperature inside the facility dropped lower than it ever had before, even though the heating systems were working at full capacity. The air carried a metallic chill, and everyone noticed it. It wasn't just the weather, it was something in the atmosphere, something that made even the lights hum differently. That was around the time A9 stopped responding. At first we thought it was fatigue or environmental stress. It no longer reacted to sound frequencies, light cues, or even direct commands from the intercom. It simply stood in the center of its containment room, head tilted slightly upward, as if listening to something far away. For hours at a time it wouldn't move. No blinking, no signs of agitation or aggression, just stillness. Lang would have known how to interpret it, but he was gone. The new team had no idea what they were dealing with. They tried increasing the decibel output, adjusting frequencies, even shocking the air inside the chamber with electromagnetic pulses to provoke a response. Nothing worked. It was as though A9 had disconnected itself from us entirely. Then, one night, something happened that none of us could explain. Around 2:30 a.m., the sensors in the containment wing began picking up vibrations that didn't match any internal system. The sound registers flashed with low-frequency spikes, waves so deep they bordered on subsonic. The readings came not from the chamber, but from outside the base perimeter. The technicians replayed the data 3 times before realizing it wasn't a malfunction. The origin of the sound was the forest. We activated the external monitors, expecting to see wildlife near the fences, maybe heavy snow movement. But the cameras showed nothing, just static. The vibrations continued for nearly 20 minutes, fluctuating in rhythm like a slow, deliberate pulse. Every few seconds, the glass in the observation window quivered slightly, and the temperature in the room dropped by 2 degrees. A9 lifted its head. For the first time in weeks, it moved, but not toward us. Its gaze shifted to the far wall in the direction of the woods. It stood perfectly still again, shoulders tense, breathing slow. Then, without warning, the vibrations stopped. The following morning, we conducted an external inspection. Snow had fallen heavily overnight, leaving the ground blanketed and undisturbed, except for one place. Near the northern perimeter, where the fence met the tree line, we found a series of impressions in the snow. They weren't from boots, and they weren't animal tracks. The prints were enormous, nearly half a meter long, spaced evenly apart, leading straight toward the fence. But the most disturbing part wasn't where they started, it was where they ended. The tracks didn't stop at the fence. They continued beyond it, right up to the outer wall of the facility, where the snow had been disturbed in a wide circle. There were multiple sets of prints, at least 3 different patterns, all large, all heavy. They converged at one point, directly in front of the reinforced wall of A9's chamber. We reported the findings immediately. The director ordered the security footage reviewed, but when the technicians pulled up the overnight feeds, half of them were corrupted. The timestamps between 2 and 3 a.m. were missing across every camera facing the forest. The only intact footage was from inside the lab. It showed A9 standing motionless in the dark, facing the wall, its breath visible in the freezing air. The microphones picked up a faint sound during those missing minutes, a single low vibration that came not from the speakers, but from inside the chamber. After that night, no one used the term specimen anymore. Even the guards who never stepped foot in the lab began avoiding the western corridor altogether. A9 refused food, refused interaction, and refused containment routines. It wasn't defiance, it was distraction, like it was waiting for something only it could hear. By mid-January, the reports referred to the incident simply as external resonance event. The file was classified above Omega level, locked behind digital firewalls none of us could access. But I didn't need access to understand what it meant. The creature hadn't gone dormant. It had made contact. And judging by the tracks in the snow, it hadn't done it alone. A week later, the base went into what they called a temporary operational suspension. That was the official phrase they used over the radio. In reality, it meant lockdown. Trucks arrived before dawn, loaded with crates and armed escorts. Most of the staff were evacuated without explanation. Scientists, technicians, security teams, everyone. Only 6 of us remained, handpicked for reasons we were never told. I was one of them. They said we were needed for observation. The tone they used made it clear. We were not volunteers. By the 3rd night, the silence around the camp was unbearable. No radio chatter, no background hum from the generators, just the soft buzz of the fluorescent lights and the rhythmic pulse of the containment monitors. Outside, snow fell nonstop, piling against the windows, turning the forest into a wall of white. The schedule said we were supposed to conduct final system integrity tests, but no one was running diagnostics anymore. We were just watching, waiting. At 03:47 a.m., the external motion sensors picked up movement beyond the perimeter. The feed from the thermal cameras came online automatically, filling the control room with ghostly shapes moving between the trees. They were tall, unnaturally tall, and there were more than one. At first, it looked like shadows gliding through the forest, but the measurements didn't lie. 3 meters in height, dense thermal signatures, humanoid outlines. Someone whispered, "It's just interference," but we all knew interference didn't have a pulse. The lights flickered, and then the backup alarms went off. Power levels dropped across every system. The electromagnetic locks flicked from red to yellow, a warning phase we'd only seen once before, the night Nolan disappeared. I remember glancing at the containment camera, just in time to see A9 lift its head. Its eyes reflected the emergency light like amber glass. The glass of the chamber vibrated once, twice, and then a sound, deep and resonant, filled the air, too low to be mechanical. The outer cameras caught one final image, the fence line collapsing inward, snow whipping into a white blur, shadows moving fast between the trees. Then, without warning, the power grid failed completely. Every monitor in the control room went black. The only illumination came from the emergency strobes, flashing red across our faces. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then, from the direction of the lab came a sound that didn't belong in any man-made structure. A metallic groan, followed by the sharp crack of breaking glass. The chamber's observation window had shattered, not from impact, but from within. The temperature plummeted. The air itself seemed to pulse, bending light as though the walls were vibrating. Someone yelled to reset the generators, but the command never reached the mainframe. The last image burned into my memory is of that broken containment glass, curling outward as if something had passed through it, not out of force, but of pressure, as if the structure had been rewritten from the inside. Then the screens filled with static, and the signal died. When the power returned hours later, the containment room was empty. A9 was gone. There were no signs of struggle, no damage except the fractured glass, and no trace of anyone who had been stationed in the lower wing. The official time of system failure was logged as 3:51. Total duration, 4 minutes. By morning, the evacuation order came through. No debrief, no paperwork, just orders to pack and board the convoy. When we left, the base already looked abandoned. Snow had swallowed the tracks of the vehicles, and the wind howled through the broken antennas. As we drove out, I looked back once, and saw the faint outline of the facility fading into the fog. For a moment, I could have sworn there was movement near the tree line, something standing just beyond the wreckage, watching. 2 days later, I was relocated to Colorado Springs, given new credentials, a fabricated medical record, and a non-disclosure agreement marked Omega Silence. They told me the official explanation would be a reactor malfunction resulting in a controlled implosion. It was laughable. There was no reactor at Echo Pines. But when I asked for clarification, the officer across the table just stared at me, expressionless, and said, "You were never there, mister." Cross. They discharged me under medical grounds 3 weeks later. No pension, no record of service. My clearance was revoked, and every file connected to my name was flagged as inactive. I wasn't fired, I was erased. The others who had remained behind with me vanished into the system, reassigned or buried under false identities. Sometimes I still dream about that night. The static on the monitors, the vibration in the air, the way the glass didn't break so much as breathe. I used to think what escaped that room was just one being. Now, I'm not sure it was ever alone. A year after the shutdown, I tried to find proof, any trace that Echo Pines had ever existed. The official records listed it as a decommissioned communications facility, deconstructed due to environmental instability. No mention of Project A9, no personnel files, no requisition orders. When I reached out to a contact still in the agency, he said the base's archive had been restructured, the bureaucratic term for erased. Every server replaced, every document rewritten, every paper trail sealed under new project codes that led nowhere. I spent months chasing ghosts through government databases, but each search ended the same way: empty results, access denied flags, and one identical timestamp marking the purge date, February 17, 1994. Even the satellite imagery of that region had been altered. The coordinates where the camp once stood now showed nothing but dense forest and ice. as if the earth itself had folded over to hide what had been there. The only piece of evidence I managed to keep wasn't digital. It was something small enough to escape notice during the evacuation, an old handheld tape recorder I used for field notes. I found it months later, buried in the bottom of a duffel bag I hadn't unpacked. The label on the side had worn away, but the cassette inside was still intact. When I played it for the first time, there was nothing but static for several seconds. Then came the sound, deep, rhythmic, impossibly low. It wasn't mechanical, it was breathing. It started faintly, like distant thunder, and then grew in intensity, a pulse so slow and deliberate that it made the speakers vibrate. I felt it in my chest more than I heard it, the same tone that had shattered the containment glass, the same frequency that made the forest tremble that night. I turned it off after 10 seconds. Even now I can still feel that vibration in my bones. I've never played it again. Years passed, and I stopped trying to talk about it. The few people who knew the project existed were either gone or pretending they'd never heard the name Echo Pines. Time dulled the urgency, but not the memory. I learned to live quietly, to disappear the way they'd wanted me to. Colorado Springs became just another quiet town on a map, the kind of place where the wind sounds almost like the ocean if you close your eyes long enough. 2 decades later, I'd almost convinced myself it had all been a mistake. Maybe the cold, the isolation, and the endless hum of the machines had warped my mind. Maybe there never was a creature, only data, noise in the system, a trick of perception. That's what I told myself every December, when the nights grew longest and the air turned thin. Then, one Christmas morning, a letter arrived. No return address, no postmark, just an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a small card, plain white, unmarked except for a set of coordinates, scrawled in black ink. I entered them out of curiosity, expecting nothing. But when the map loaded, I felt my stomach tighten. The numbers pointed to the same region where Echo Pines once stood. The satellite view showed only ice, rock, and emptiness. But something about it felt wrong, like the snow didn't fall evenly there, like the shadows were deeper than they should have been. The next year, it happened again. Another card, different coordinates, always within a few miles of the original site. I stopped asking how they found me. Whoever sent them wasn't trying to threaten or expose me. They were reminding me, keeping me tethered to something that refused to die. Last year's card was the most unsettling. The coordinates pointed further north, close to the glacial ridges that mark the edge of uninhabited territory. That's land where no one goes, where the snow swallows everything, light, sound, memory. I stared at the map for a long time, tracing the white expanse with my finger. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that low vibration, faint, steady, coming from nowhere. Maybe it's just the wind through the valley, or maybe somewhere out there, buried beneath ice and silence, something is still listening. A few months ago, I received a call I wasn't supposed to. It came late at night, long after I'd stopped answering unknown numbers. The voice on the other end introduced himself as a journalist, calm and careful, the kind of tone used by someone who already knows too much. He said he'd been sent a cassette, an old magnetic tape, labeled with my name, my voice recorded on it, speaking words I hadn't said in over 20 years. I didn't ask how he got it. Some questions are dangerous, even when you already know the answer. He asked me straight out, "Is it true? Did the government try to train something non-human?" The way he said non-human made me pause. I told him that was the wrong word. Non-human implies alien, I said quietly. But we're all from the same planet. We just don't all come from the same species. There was silence on the line for almost a full minute, the kind that feels like gravity pressing against your chest. Then he asked, "Is it still alive?" I remember looking out my window when he said that. Snow had begun falling again, thick and slow, just like it did back in Washington all those years ago. I told him the only truth I had left. If it wasn't alive, I said, why are we still afraid to talk about it? He didn't reply. The line clicked, and the call ended. I haven't heard from him since. But I know he's still out there, trying to connect the dots, trying to drag a forgotten story back into the light. I almost pity him. Some truths don't want to be found. Some are buried because they remember where they were buried. 2 weeks ago, the phone rang again. No caller ID, no signal trace. This time, no one spoke at all, just sound. That same deep, pulsing frequency I'd heard once before, the one that broke the glass at Echo Pines. It filled the room, resonating through the walls, through my ribs, through the air itself. I dropped the receiver, but the sound didn't stop. It lingered for nearly half a minute, humming like a slow heartbeat, before fading back into nothing. The next day, the local news ran a short piece. Unidentified seismic disturbances recorded in the Cascade Mountains. No casualties, no damage, just tremors, rhythmic and inexplicable, likely caused by shifting ice formations. The part they didn't mention was the frequency. I checked the seismic data myself later that night. The readings matched perfectly, 18 hertz, the same frequency we use to transmit commands to A9. There's no official explanation, and there never will be. The agency moved on long ago, buried the records, replaced the names, scrubbed the data. Maybe they think the project is over. Maybe they're wrong. Sometimes I wonder if they ever really stopped listening, or if someone else started. When the wind rises after midnight, it still brings that low vibration with it, deep and distant, like the breath of something enormous moving beneath the surface of the earth. I tell myself it's just the mountains shifting, or the ocean echoing through the valleys. But there's a rhythm to it, too steady, too intentional. So if you ever find yourself awake in the dark and you hear that faint, slow pulse through the walls, don't go looking for where it's coming from. Don't try to record it or explain it. Just remember this. Sometimes silence isn't absence. Sometimes it's a reply. And somewhere, out there beyond the forests of Washington, something is still answering our signals.